Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Our guest is Flur Hassan-Nahoum, outgoing deputy mayor of Jerusalem. She is also the current special envoy for the foreign ministry of Jerusalem. And she has just flown from Jerusalem, landed in New York City just this morning. Fleur, thank you so much for making time to chat with us. Before we get into the particulars about what's happening geopolitically, can you tell me what your experience was like being in Israel during the attack on Saturday?
So, in fact, I was in the airport about to board a flight to New York when we were told that the airspace was going to close down at 1 a.m. originally, because they knew that Iran had already sent out their missiles, and so they calculated when it was going to be landing. And then they moved it forward to 12:30. So at one point, I actually didn't know if I was going to be able to get on that flight, but thankfully, we got out just in time. And my family, my husband and children, who remained in Jerusalem, spent the whole night in the shelter, scared with terrible noise from the rockets and, of course, from the anti-rocket fire.
So we have an emergency meeting underway now at this hour at the United Nations. Representatives from the UK, France, Switzerland calling for some restraint. Do you have a sense of what people in Israel are saying that they would like the government to do under these circumstances?
So first of all, the people of Israel are very traumatized, not just from a very difficult night last night, where by miracle, and of course the investment that the Israeli government has put into anti-missile fire, and also, of course, the help of the Americans and the British. But we're traumatized from October 7th. We're in the middle of a very cruel war that has taken so many of our people, that have still got hostages in Gaza. Hamas, again, this morning, rejected another peace deal. Everything could stop in Gaza in 1 hour if Hamas accepted the terms, the very generous terms of the ceasefire deal. So Israel is already traumatized. This is just an added concern, and I think it's interesting that the UN Security Council is calling for restraint on Israel. Well, why didn't anybody call for Iran's restraint before they fired over 300 rockets over to a sovereign country from their territory?
It's an interesting point you make, and I'm sure that there were a lot of people that share that perspective. But for the moment now, with the risk of escalation, is there a moment that we just have to take a kind of a breath, a pause, and look for some sort of resolution that is not about escalation?
Well, Israel has never acted impulsively. We did not act impulsively after October 7th. It took us 2.5 weeks to plan what we were going to do and go into Gaza, and we will not act impulsively now. We will think about the threat. We will think about if the threat still exists. Ultimately, all Israel wants is to defend and protect its citizens. We took our eyes off the ball one terrible day on October 7th, and look what happened.
What type of support right now is there for the policy of the current Prime Minister Netanyahu? I mean, among the population in Israel, is it a sharply divided populace, or is there more kind of unity from your point of view?
Well, we came into October 7th a very divided country because of constitutional reforms that Netanyahu and his government wanted to push through. Some of the reforms were necessary, but it was done in such an inept way that it really divided the country. And of course, the opposition took the opportunity to politicize the situation. And so we went into 7th of October, a very divided country. Since the 7th of October, we've seen unprecedented unity. But again, now you're beginning to see the cracks. You have, of course, the hostage families that are pushing for a deal. You have the opposition politicizing the fact that there hasn't been a hostage deal, which I don't think has anything to do with the government, more to do with the intransigence of Hamas. And Netanyahu has lost a lot of support. There was a poll, I think, last week that said only 15 or 20% of the population want him to continue as prime minister. But I actually believe it would be very damaging to have an election in the middle of a war. I do believe that the minute the war is over, we should have an election. We shouldn't wait until the end of the administration, which would be 2026. I think we should have an election. People should be accountable for what happened that horrible day. But at the moment, people are calling for his resignation now. That's not going to happen. You don't change horses in the middle of a race.
Fleur,
we have to see this through.
You mentioned a moment ago.
We have to see this through.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You mentioned a moment ago that Hamas has rejected the latest ceasefire proposal. We know that the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt are brokering the talks, and I'm trying to get your sense of what this weekend attack might do to those conversations. Do you expect it to kind of create greater urgency in trying to seek a resolution, or do you think this is going to create a greater divide in trying to find an agreement?
I actually think, nothing can be as bad as the situation that we have with Hamas. So maybe the fact that Israel could attack Iran, and this could really conflagrate into a very horrible regional war and even a world war. I wouldn't, if Israel didn't have the anti-missile fire defense system it has, we would have had yesterday a genocide in Israel with the 300-plus missiles that were thrown, including ballistic missiles. And so the fact that we have a strong defense does not mean that Iran can attack Israel with impunity and everybody sits. So maybe there's a chance that with all of this mess, there can be some type of regional arrangement that includes the hostages being returned and talk about Gaza the day after the war and the day after Hamas. Israel can no longer live with a terrorist group such as Hamas threatening its people on its border. And so if the world understands that, certainly the moderate Arab countries understand that. The Sunni countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they certainly understand who Hamas are, the Muslim Brotherhood are. They kicked them out of their own countries. And so if the Western world actually understands that Israel can no longer live with Hamas, and we can start talking about how the Palestinian people get a decent future for themselves, then maybe there's a chance that this could calm down.
So from what I understand, Israel's war cabinet was in session on Sunday trying to work out a possible response. Can you take me inside the political makeup of the war cabinet and talk to me, give me a little bit of insight into the dynamics and how they are playing out?
Yes. So the war cabinet is actually comprised of what we're calling a unity government. In other words, on the 7th of October, after the terrible massacre happened, Netanyahu called for a unity government, and two of the leaders of the opposition joined him. And so the security cabinet now consists of not just people on the right, but people in the center and people on the left, as well as, of course, the military leadership. And so what I would say is there are differing opinions in the war cabinet, but everybody is either a general, an ex-chief of staff, or somebody very high up in the current government. And there are rumors, Israeli press is talking about the fact that, in fact, the center and left ex-chiefs of staff wanted an immediate reprisal and that the rest of the cabinet didn't. Then I heard 2 hours later that it was the other way around. So you never know because things get leaked. And, of course, everything is off the record in the war cabinet. But there are definitely divisions, and there are people who want to attack Iran quickly and decisively, and there are other people that want to calm the situation down and see what will happen and see how the UN reacts and see how the United States can get more involved and try and guarantee our security. But ultimately the way I see it is that Iran has gotten away with so much for so long. They are the biggest exporters of terrorism. They're working through their proxies, who are Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis who've attacked American assets, as you know. They've got groups in Iraq, they've got groups in Afghanistan, and they've got Qatar as their mouthpiece. So Iran has never actually had the faith to attack from their territory. It's always been through proxies. And now, the reckoning is coming right to them. The question is, what will they do with this? But I think that ultimately the world is going to have to face Iran either now or in a few years, and let's hope they don't get nuclear weapons.
We'll leave it there. Flur Hassan-Nahoum, outgoing deputy mayor of Jerusalem, also current special envoy to the foreign ministry of Jerusalem, joining here on Daybreak Asia. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a closer look at what's happening with respect to Iran's attack over the weekend on Israel. Let's bring in Joe Mathieu, co-host of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Joe, you and I were talking a short while ago about the risk of retaliation on the part of Israel. And earlier this hour, I was speaking with the current special envoy for the foreign ministry for Jerusalem, and she was trying to give me an understanding of what was going on within the war cabinet in Israel. They had a meeting over the weekend, and one of the things that struck me is how mercurial this is. I mean, it's still very, very fluid. I don't think anyone has a definite position. She talked about the fact that there's a kind of a dynamic happening within the war cabinet, and I don't think that it's coalesced around a kind of a central point of view. I mean, this is a remarkable time that Israel finds itself in. Yes, there's war in Gaza. We understand that. For the last 6 months, it's been just this sense of upheaval within Israel. And now this. I mean, how do you think this is going to play out in the psyche of the American population that finds itself gripped by this story that we've been describing for the last 6 months?
Well, you're asking all the right questions here, Doug, and it's difficult to tell. There's going to be an actual way to measure that, most likely this week with a vote in the House of Representatives, and we're not sure how that's going to go. We understand that the president convened a call this afternoon. The White House just let us know this with the leaders of the Senate and the House, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Speaker Johnson, and, of course, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, to talk about the urgent need to pass and the national security supplemental that has already cleared the Senate. It's unclear that will even happen because Speaker Johnson has a fractured Republican conference that doesn't want to see this move in one block and may not want to see Ukraine funding move at all. One thing I will tell you, though, Doug, is Steve Scalise, the majority leader, issued a statement earlier today saying in light of Iran's attack, the House will change its legislative schedule next week to consider legislation that, as he puts it, supports our ally Israel. It makes no mention of Ukraine. So this may depend on the conversation Mike Johnson had with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. His influence here is going to have a lot to do with the outcome as the White House works overtime to try to prevent Israel from retaliating against Iran. That may be a fool's errand. It's very difficult to tell at this early hour, but if there is an over-the-top response from Israel, it could make it more difficult to pass funding here in the U.S. because of opposition from progressive Democrats.
So you alluded to these sharp divisions within the GOP, and I'm wondering if there are other voices that we should be, you mentioned Steve Scalise, other voices that we should be paying close attention to in the week ahead.
Well, it's going to be Mike Johnson more than anyone, because people just don't know exactly what the speaker is going to do here, and he has very little time to make some decisions on this, as I mentioned, coming off of his visit to Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump, and they surely spoke about Ukraine funding while he was there, not necessarily knowing the outcome of these attacks. But to get back to where you started our conversation here in what's taking place right now in Tel Aviv, for instance, where the lack of casualties, the lack of damage has really left them with a decision to make here. Israel could limit its strike because of this. But Benjamin Netanyahu is under enormous pressure from the right inside his government to do something. Just imagine, Doug, if we weren't telling this remarkable story of 99% of these rockets and missiles being knocked out of the sky. In that world, you could have hundreds of Israelis who were killed. And the government does feel like there's a need to say something about that, even as the White House says, take the win.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about whether we know anything about what has been happening in terms of communication between the White House and Netanyahu's office. Do we know that the president became concerned about an overreaction here and maybe was forceful in saying, I know that was kind of the message that was delivered after October 7th. The Biden administration tried to issue a very cautionary kind of guidance here. It was the same thing happening over the weekend, do you think?
Well, they spoke today. The New York Times has been reporting that the president told Benjamin Netanyahu that if he does strike back against Iran, that the U.S. will not back that move. If you look at the readout from the White House, he talks about speaking with Netanyahu to reaffirm America's ironclad commitment to the security of Israel. So he's really kind of dancing on two sides here, and the White House will be in an incredibly awkward position if Israel decides to go hard on this. Look, we've heard conversations for the last 24 hours now, and a lot of them broke out on Sunday morning television, where a lot of hawks had things to say about this. John Bolton, it should come as no surprise, said that this is the opportunity that Israel has now to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons program. That would be the extreme response in this case, and it would likely provoke something more. The idea of this being escalatory as opposed to a standoff is what we're talking about.
Joe, before I let you go, the notion of ceasefire, I know that Hamas has rejected a proposal that was put forward over the weekend. Do you think this gives a greater urgency to try to find a solution on that front as well?
Well, look, I'd love to say yes. It's hard to tell. We heard from John Kirby on this earlier today. The White House is just asking Hamas to take the deal, knowing that, they've left Cairo. They're not at the table right now. They may be continuing to share information, but, they're waiting for somebody to call them back. And that's not a great situation to be in, Doug. There's a real worry right now by a lot of the folks that we're talking to that the hostages Hamas has been talking about and dealing with here, many of them may not be alive or able to be identified. That would be a game changer.
Joe, always a pleasure. Thanks for making time for us. Joe Mathieu, co-host of Balance of Power, which you can hear on Bloomberg Radio and watch on Bloomberg TV. Let's get to our guest. George Cipolloni is with us. George is portfolio manager at Penn Mutual Asset Management. He joins us from Philadelphia. Thanks for making time for us on a Sunday night, George. We can talk about Fed policy, but I want to get your sense of how geopolitical tension right now and these events that we've been talking about, whether it's Israel, Gaza, Israel now, and Iran, the attack over the weekend, how that's impacting your thinking when it comes to how markets are behaving and how to put capital to work.
Hey, Doug, great to be with you again. And yeah, first and foremost, prayers to everyone in the Middle East. Hopefully it does not escalate. So yeah, as a portfolio manager, you just mentioned geopolitical risk, and that's one of the risks that we have to be cognizant of. It's one that we don't think about on a daily basis, but when it shows up, it's important to know that in your portfolio, you have some margin of safety. And so I think if we're looking at some areas in the market right now, obviously the ones that are acting a little, and I don't want to say strangely, but gold, for example, has been up a lot over this past year. And while, gold obviously would be a good hedge right now. If you think about longer treasuries, which really haven't done as well, that might be a pretty good hedge too for, at least for some margin of safety. Yeah,
it's very interesting that you mentioned gold. Intraday Friday, we topped 2,400 an ounce. That was another record high. We've settled back. I'm looking at a spot price right now at around 23.57. You mentioned the bond market, and it's been very interesting to gauge, what the bond market is trying to tell us. And we know what the Fed has been saying. That they are less apt to kind of cut interest rates. They want to really be confident that the inflation demon has been slayed and that, the issue has been put to rest. Are you seeing a lot more volatility in the bond market between, let's say, now and the end of the year?
We are, Doug, and it's amazing this skew that we're starting to see in terms of the S&P. If you think about where it bottomed back in last fall, it was mainly because interest rates, the 10-year, for example, had hit 5%. The market does not like 5% on the 10-year. So as interest rates fell, the stock market resumed its path higher, and it was a very strong rally. Now, if you just look at from the end of March to now, the S&P is down about 3%. And so this latest skew in terms of interest rates going from 420 to 450, I think we're at a very important point as to what comes next. You mentioned the Fed. Obviously, the market was completely wrong in pricing in more than 160 basis points worth of cuts, and now we're at around 40 basis points. And we still are not certain, given the data that we are seeing, given the up move in oil and gas, for example, and other items, obviously, we're not even sure if the Fed's going to be able to cut it all this year now. So there is some doubt.
So does growth hold up, or are we talking about a situation that may be best described as stagflation? Is that a real risk?
And that's exactly the word. That's one of the things I have written down, because now that threat comes into it, and we haven't seen an environment like that in a very, very long time. So going back to your first question, in terms of growth stocks, the momentum factor has been a huge factor for what has done well in the markets, and it's left almost everything else in the dust. I like dividend yield stocks. They've done relatively poorly. I love value stocks. They've done relatively poorly. And the market just wants momentum and growth. And so now as we get up to this level again in interest rates of around 4.5% on the 10-year, this next move up could challenge those valuations for growth stocks.
So we had earnings from the big banks, a few of them last Friday, JP Morgan among them, better than expected first quarter profit and revenue. But one of the things that Jamie Dimon was pointing out is that higher interest rates are forcing the banks to pay out more than they thought they would have to pay out in customer deposits. And Dimon went on to say that he cannot say whether or not the economy is going to go into a recession, but the chance of bad outcomes right now, in Dimon's view, is higher than people think. Would you agree with that?
I would, and Dimon is such a gem, and he's so unique from most CEOs just want to give a rosy and optimistic point of view. Jamie's been a little bit wrong, I'd say, over the past year, because he's given the negative side too. None of those have really manifested themselves yet, but yes, he gives a more balanced view of of the potential outcomes. And I do think like that. I think most portfolio managers think in terms of outcome, and we have to weigh the possibility of positive and negative outcomes. And so in this moment right now, yes, if you look at, for example, banks in particular, their net interest income has been challenged, and that's one of the reasons why all the banks, just about all of them, went down on their earnings, which were generally pretty good for the last 3 months. But now, how are they going to be for the next few quarters? And I think that's the question now. So
much of what we've seen lately in terms of market gains has been in some way tied to this artificial intelligence theme. Are you still a buyer of that?
So as a dividend yield and value investor, we don't get a lot of easy ways to play that. Now, I will say what is starting to creep up is the energy demand is going to be so significant, it should benefit utilities, which look pretty cheap here. So I think that is one way where we could participate versus the direct impact of buying Microsoft or Nvidia, for example, which again are a little bit outside of our universe. But yes, I think that trend obviously is a lot of the growth is already priced in. So they're going to have to continue to keep doing well. But outside of that, again, if you just look at energy or utilities and some other areas that you wouldn't necessarily think of from an AI standpoint, I do think there could be some benefit there as well.
So I'm wondering whether or not the government's attempt to stimulate the economy, whether through the Inflation Reduction Act, we're talking about some of the green initiatives, or maybe just infrastructure as a pure play, roads and bridges. I mean, let's think materials, let's think industrial shares. Do they represent value in your thinking?
They really do. And so one area that has not been discussed very much has been commodities. Almost every commodity really looks good. I mean, they've kind of not gone up as much as the S&P, but we touched on gold, for example, which is outside of your question, but gold miners look really cheap even relative to the price of gold. Aluminum, for example, looks pretty cheap. Copper prices are starting to go up, and now those miners are starting to do well. So yes, to your point, these underlying commodities, there's been some nice pocket of value there, and some of these stocks are just starting to look good again.
Are you fully invested right now, or are you sitting on a little bit of cash, George?
We always have a little bit of cash. I would say for us, so we can go up to 20% in cash, and we certainly don't have anywhere near that level. We are closer to fully invested. We have about 3.5% in cash. I will say we do have a lot of, so our margin of safety is going to be our front end debt. So we have a lot of short-term bonds that are issued by companies that have more cash than debt. I do think good balance sheets, high quality balance sheets, is a great place to hide in an environment where we see some volatility.
George, we'll leave it there. Thanks for making time to chat with us. George Cipolloni is portfolio manager at Penn Mutual Asset Management, on the line from Philadelphia here on Daybreak Asia. This has been the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.